What if I told you, in the year 1847, deep in Georgia, there was a plantation where the horrors of slavery went far beyond chains and whips. A place where bloodlines were twisted, and a mother forced her own sons into something so disturbing, even history tried to bury it. This is the untold story of Georgia's darkest secret. The year was 1847. Georgia was one of the beating hearts of the plantation South. Cotton and tobacco fields stretched as far as the eye could see, worked by enslaved men and women who lived lives of unimaginable suffering. At the center of one such plantation stood the house of Margaret Hollingsworth, a widow of wealth and cruelty. Locals called her the Lady of the Iron Whip. She was known not just for her coldness, but for her obsession with power, control, and breeding. On plantations, enslaved people were treated like property, and many owners bred them like livestock, forcing men and women to reproduce so their children could be sold. But Margaret's obsession went further. Margaret had 3 sons, Thomas, Edward, and Samuel. Raised under her strict and brutal rule, they were taught that enslaved people were not human beings but tools. They grew up in a household where cruelty was normal, and silence was demanded. But as the plantation fell into debt, Margaret became desperate. She believed she had found a way to save her estate, by creating new stock. And the way she carried out this plan, would stain her family name forever. Instead of simply forcing enslaved men and women together, Margaret devised a chilling method. She ordered her own sons to breed with enslaved women. At first they resisted in horror. But her authority was absolute. She manipulated them with threats, with guilt, even with beatings. By the late summer of 1847, the enslaved women of the Hollingsworth plantation began to whisper. Strange pregnancies appeared. And the faces of the newborns carried disturbing resemblances to Margaret's sons. For the enslaved community, this was not just cruelty, it was a nightmare that blurred every boundary of humanity. Mothers wept as they gave birth to children they never chose to conceive. Fathers were powerless, forced to watch their families torn apart. Imagine this. You are enslaved, stripped of freedom, and one night the master's son, trembling and ashamed, is pushed into your cabin under orders. What would you do? Resist and risk your life? Or obey and lose a part of your soul forever? These were the choices Margaret forced upon her plantation. In October of that year, tragedy struck. One enslaved woman, Sarah, died during childbirth. Her body was buried in silence, without a prayer, without a marker. But the enslaved community knew why she had died. They knew whose child she had been forced to carry. The whispers grew louder. Servants in the house began to speak of strange cries in the night. Of Samuel, the youngest son, weeping in the stables after being forced into unspeakable acts. And Jonathan, the overseer of the plantation, claimed he once saw Margaret standing in the nursery staring at the newborns, whispering, "Strong stock. Strong blood." Backhand index pointing right. Let me ask you this. How far do you think people can go when power is unchecked? If a mother could turn her sons into monsters under her control, what does that tell you about the darkness in human nature? By the winter of 1847, rumors had escaped the plantation. A preacher traveling through Georgia heard whispers of the Hollingsworth breeding experiments. He warned that such evil could only bring ruin. And he was right. Because soon one of Margaret's sons, Edward, could not take it any longer. He confessed, trembling, to a local sheriff. But instead of arresting Margaret, the sheriff laughed it off. Plantation owners, after all, were untouchable. Yet behind closed doors, the horror continued. And it was only a matter of time before blood was spilled. Because in the year 1848, one of the Hollingsworth sons would finally snap. And what he did next would expose Georgia's darkest secret. You've heard how the Hollingsworth plantation turned into a breeding ground of horror. But what came next would shock even those who thought they had seen every cruelty of slavery. Because in 1848, blood would be spilled, not just of the enslaved but of the family itself. Edward Hollingsworth, the second son, could no longer live with the guilt. He had nightmares of Sarah, the enslaved woman who had died. He saw her face every night, screaming in the darkness. He turned to alcohol, then to rage. Finally, one stormy night, Edward confronted his mother. He shouted in the parlor, his voice trembling. "You made us monsters. You made us damn ourselves." Margaret slapped him across the face. Her cold reply echoed, "You did what was required. For the family. For survival." That night, Edward disappeared. Some claimed he fled Georgia, others whispered he hanged himself in the woods. But one thing was certain. The family was beginning to collapse from within. Meanwhile, the enslaved quarters were filled with grief. Children born from Margaret's plan lived in confusion, half accepted, half rejected. Their very existence was a reminder of the horrors their mothers had endured. One child, a boy named Elijah, grew up with eyes so strikingly similar to Samuel's that even neighbors could not ignore it. Rumors spread once more, and this time the Hollingsworth family could not silence them. In the spring of 1849, disaster struck. The Hollingsworth plantation house burned to the ground. Some claimed it was lightning. Others whispered it was set ablaze by the enslaved, a final act of vengeance. Margaret Hollingsworth was never seen again. Some said she perished in the flames. Others swore she fled north under a false name. Her sons scattered, Jonathan inheriting what was left, Samuel broken beyond repair. But the enslaved community remembered. And the story spread like wildfire, passed down from generation to generation. The tale of Margaret Hollingsworth is not just about slavery, it is about what happens when power is absolute, when human beings are stripped of dignity, and when even family bonds are twisted into instruments of cruelty. The plantation lady who forced her own sons to breed enslaved women represents the darkest corners of human history. And while the records of her deeds were buried, the whispers remain. Backhand index pointing right. If you lived in 1847 Georgia, and you heard these whispers, would you speak out? Or would fear keep you silent? Backhand index pointing right. Do you believe evil like this can still exist today, hidden in plain sight? This was the hidden story of Margaret Hollingsworth and the Hollingsworth Plantation, a chapter of slavery so disturbing, even history tried to erase it. If this story shocked you, here's what I need you to do. Thumbs up like this video if it opened your eyes. Speech balloon comment your thoughts. Would you have had the courage to stop her? Bell subscribe for more dark, untold histories that most people will never dare to tell. Because the past is full of secrets, and some are too horrifying to forget.